In April 1942, the Japanese Army forced more than 10,000 American POWs on an 85-mile march. Nearly 1,000 died, and many who survived were made slave laborers in Japanese plants for 3.5 years. James Parkinson and Lee Benson chronicle the legal efforts of one of the GIs, Harold Poole, to receive restitution in their new book, Soldier Slaves. Next on Book TV, the co-authors are joined by Utah Senator Orrin Hatch, who recently introduced legislation to help the enslaved soldiers receive compensation. This event from Deseret Books in Salt Lake City is about an hour.
Thank you so much for coming. On behalf of the company, Deseret Book welcomes you. We are thrilled today to have the authors and the gentleman who the story is based upon here to speak for a few minutes. The way the event will work is we will first hear from James W. Parkinson. He obtained his law degree from Brigham Young University here in Utah. He currently lives in California with his wife Susan, and he practices, he has a private practice there. We will then have a few remarks from Lee Benson. Lee is a native of Utah. He is a columnist here for the Deseret Morning News, and he has also co-authored many other books and authored other books. And then we will hear from Harold Poole. Harold Poole is a Salt Lake resident who is a war hero. He was a mail carrier for 30 years, and then he retired. He served in World War II at the start of the Bataan Death March. He was captured and was a part of the Bataan Death March. He was under Japanese control for 3.5 years, and he earned his Silver Star during that war. He is a man of great valor and honor and courage, and we are pleased that they are here. So we will go to that point.
Thank you very much for that introduction. On behalf of Lee Benson and Harold Poole and myself, we welcome you here today. We appreciate the opportunity to speak about our book. I guess the best place to begin is in the beginning. December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy, according to Roosevelt, our president. Most people, when they hear that date, think of Pearl Harbor and how the Japanese were involved in that sneak attack and killed about 2,700 Americans. That same day, which is December the 8th, 1941, the Japanese attacked Manila in the Philippines. The difference being they invaded the Philippines and they did not invade the Hawaiian Islands. When that attack took place on December 8, 1941, Harold Poole was there. Along with the American servicemen, he fought under the command of General MacArthur until April 9, 1942. And on that date, the largest contingent of American soldiers in history was surrendered to the Japanese. The Japanese did not anticipate there would be that many American soldiers surrendered. They didn't know how to transport them from Mariveles to the prison camps. So what they did is they had the men begin a 85-mile walk without adequate food, without adequate water, and then they beat them. And they bayoneted the men, they buried men alive, and then when they arrived at the prison camps, the torture continued. It's difficult for those of us who were born after World War II to really put our arms around the enormity of what happened in the Bataan Death March, but let me give you a little arithmetic that might help you out. If you take the number of American soldiers and the number of Filipino soldiers who died on that 5-day march and divide it into the number of miles, you had a dead body every 30 feet for 85 miles. Sitting behind me is a survivor of the Bataan Death March, Harold Poole. On the day the war broke out, Harold Poole was walking out of a mess cafeteria, and he looked up in the sky and he saw these Japanese planes, but he didn't know they were Japanese at the time until the bombs started to fall. When the bombs started to fall and they were blowing up buildings and whatnot, Harold had to do something. So he immediately jumped into a foxhole that had a machine gun mounted on a pole. When the bombing stopped, he looked up and he saw the Japanese Zeros, the pursuit planes coming in, strafing the field. And you know, you see those puffs in movies of the bullets hitting around. Well, Harold Poole was in a foxhole watching a Japanese Zero approach at 75 feet over his head. He had the presence of mind to take that machine gun, which was a Lewis World War II machine gun, air-cooled, and aim it at a Japanese Zero coming right at him. He got it sighted, pulled the trigger, and the gun jammed. Luckily for Harold Poole, the Japanese Zero missed him, circled, but when it came around again, by that time Harold Poole had cleaned the gun with the rag he kept in the back of his pocket, and this time when it came around, Harold took dead aim, and when it was 75 feet over his head, he shot and killed the pilot, and the plane crashed. According to the history that Lee Benson and I researched, that was the first Japanese plane to be shot down during the Battle of Manila. For that heroic act, the United States of America awarded Harold Poole with the Silver Star. I had an interesting experience with Harold as we progressed in a case I handled. You see, back in 1999, the California legislature passed a bill allowing lawsuits to be brought against Japanese corporations who used American soldiers as slaves. And when Harold Poole finished the Bataan Death March, he was shipped to Japan in what they called a hell ship, turned over to a private company, Nippon Steel, and used as slave labor for a private corporation. Well, because of a bill that was passed in California, a group of lawyers got together and said, let's sue those companies and make them pay the just compensation these men are owed. And Harold Poole ended up being one of my clients. When the lawsuit proceeded, one of the things that happened is your senator from Utah, Orrin Hatch, when he was chairman of the Senate Judiciary, called a hearing to find out why the State Department of our country was filing statements of interest in court against these men. So they couldn't get just compensation against the Japanese corporations. I know a little bit about lawsuits because I've handled a lot of them, and I thought it would probably be in our best interest if at this hearing Harold Poole appeared and testified, which he did with 3 other Bataan survivors. I asked Harold Poole, I said, Harold, we're going to be in Washington, D.C. There's a lot of media. The international media is going to be there. Would you be so kind to bring your Silver Star with you? And when you're in that Senate Judiciary hearing room, have it on your lapel so everybody can identify my client as a war hero. And he said he'd be more than happy to do that. But when we got in the Senate Judiciary room, if you've never been there, it's rather intimidating. I'm standing there with Harold. All the Klieg lights go on, and I look at his lapel, and there's no Silver Star. And I lean over, and I said, Harold, did you forget the Silver Star? He said, no, Parky, I didn't. And he reaches in his pocket, and he pulls out the box, the original box the medal came in, and he opened it up, and he said, can you help me put it on? I've never worn it. The humility of the American soldier, the humility and the honor that they bring to us as a people is one of the things that Lee Benson and I have tried to portray in the book Soldiers, Slaves. In the book, we chronicle the history of Harold Poole as he begins the war, as he shoots down the plane, and as he lives his life. We then tell the history of the lawsuit, and then we talk about what happened in Congress. It's difficult for a non-writer to put all this together. So I was very fortunate to have as my co-author one of the best writers in America, Lee Benson. And I'd like to call on him now to just briefly talk to us about writing the book and about Harold Poole and about our experience. Lee?
Thank you, and it is a pleasure to be here, and I can't think of two finer men I'd rather be sandwiched in between than Jim Parkinson and Harold Poole. I had an opportunity as a writer to get involved with them, and it's just one of the really good things about writing is the people you meet and the stories that you hear. And I've always been intimidated thinking about writing a novel because I'm not clever enough to think up the plot. But when you write nonfiction, you already have the plot right there for you. And when Jim came to me and told me about the lawsuit that was proceeding, where these prisoners of war, the Japanese from World War II, were suing the companies that had used them as slave labor and had never paid them any wages, I found the story very compelling. Not only are the corporations that we're talking about some of the richest and most recognizable on the earth, such as Mitsubishi and Kawasaki and Nippon Steel, but the men who were filing the lawsuit are of a rare breed. And I found out that as soon as I met Harold and as soon as I heard about his story, that it was one that I felt honored to be able to write. And when Jim came to me with a story that's both present day, the lawsuit proceeded right here in our modern times, and yet also talks about something that happened more than 60 years ago, that was a bit of a challenge to try to figure out how to tell those two stories, the then and the now. So we kind of hit upon a formula that I think works, and I hope you'll find when you read the book, where we alternate what's happening in the present day, and then we go back and it gives us an opportunity to tell Harold Poole's story and what happened to him from the time he arrived in the Philippines, left his house here in the avenues, and joined the army, wound up in the Philippines, happened to be there when the Japanese attacked, and then had an adventure and a prisoner of war experience that lasted 3.5 years. So we're able to tell that story, and what I think it delivers is beyond a lot of the debate about whether these soldiers should be compensated for the slave labor and other things that happened. It delivers a story about character and about people who stood by their principles, who didn't ever give up. And Harold Poole is a living example of that. And more important, just as important, is the example that he's set since he came back from the war. And he hasn't drawn attention to himself. He hasn't ever stood up. Today may be the largest, counting the TV audience, that he's ever had in telling this story. And he certainly hasn't been his own PR firm. But to be able to hear the story about people who are patriots, who stand by their principles, and do it for a lifetime is very inspiring to me. I'm just lucky to be able to have been a part of this. Jim turned me loose and let me research all kinds of material about World War II. I was able to go to the Philippines with Harold and with Jim and with Paul Warner, and we were able to, in between, what were those shakes we drank? The mango shakes. In between the mango shakes, we were able to actually walk along the dusty roads of Bataan, the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines, and catch just a little bit of an idea, because it hasn't changed much, of what it was like, the heat, the humidity, and the conditions there when these men had to walk for 85 miles without any food or water beyond what they could sneak. So it's a great story. I'm really lucky to be a part of it, and I would like to sit down and have you meet and listen to Harold Poole. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure and an honor for me to be here today and be able to say a few words. I am particularly pleased to be here in the company of my good friends Jim Parkinson and Lee Benson. Consider hat. Both of these men are blessed with talent for words, be it spoken or written. They have used their talents to record forever two courageous stories about sacrifice and fighting against formidable forces. Both stories are true and are interwoven in a compelling manner in their book, Soldier Slaves. I know this because I personally lived through one of the stories, and I watched as Jim fought the legal battles of the other one. I was humbled and gratified that Jim chose to choose my personal experiences on the Bataan Death March and subsequent years of slave labor to illustrate the horrific treatment of the Japanese of the World War II prisoners of war. I agreed to let Jim use my story because I knew it was representative of thousands of others. A few of us lucky ones came home from the war and were thus able to tell our stories. But far too many of our hero comrades in arms never came home. I shared my story for them. I wanted their stories to be told, too, even if through the lens of my own experiences. While each prisoner of war story and experiences were unique in some ways, there was a shared pain and common misery that forever made us a band of brothers. This is an unbreakable bond that will forever bind us together, known and understood only to those who were there and those who paid the price of admission to our brotherhood. The other story, of course, is the heroic efforts of Jim and his professional friends all around the country who combined their legal talents and personal resources to try and bring some justice to some old soldiers, including myself. That justice has now been denied for over 60 years. It is also a story worth knowing, and I am personally so very grateful for the efforts of Jim and his friends on behalf of me and my buddies. They didn't do it for the money. Indeed, they have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars of their own money to fight the fight with